it's Art from my new microphone. Let's discuss my top 11 tips for utilizing automation in a mix. Let's begin quickly by answering what automation is. Automation in music and mixing refers to the automatic adjustments of parameters and switches during mix playback. With automation, we can effectively write in these adjustments into the mix session and have them be performed automatically during playback and bouncing. With modern digital audio workstations, we can automate virtually anything within a mix session, and utilizing automation can really bring our static mixes up to a more professional level. So automation is super important in mixing, and without further ado, let's get into those 11 tips. The first automation tip I have for you is to automate the fader or volume control of a track pre or post compression. We can think of a compressor as a sort of automatic volume control, where as the signal level surpasses a threshold, the compressor will automatically reduce the level of the signal. However, certain audio signals will be a bit too dynamic for compression to work super effectively. If you've been mixing for a while, you've likely heard what an overcompressed signal sounds like and how it may not be the best option for a mix. So then, if there are only a few tiny sections that need additional dynamic control, say in a very percussive vocal, we can opt to automate the fader level of the vocal track post-compression rather than relying solely on compression to do the job for us. Alternatively, if we need to feed the compressor with a more consistent level to ensure that the compressor is not overworking, we can always opt to adjust the level of the signal going into the compressor. It's critical to note here that any inserts on a track are pre-fader, and so fader movements of a track will adjust the volume post-compression, and if we need to adjust the volume pre-compression, we'll have to use a trim or gain plugin and automate that in order to do so. I also have a video discussing my top 11 tips for utilizing compression in the mix, and I would encourage you to check that out in the description box below after this video. The second automation tip I have for you is to boost fills and embellishments with fader automation. If there's a specific guitar lick that really demands attention but is sitting a little bit quiet in the mix, we can simply automate the volume of that specific embellishment in the mix before bringing it back down. That way we can draw special attention to that specific embellishment before bringing the track back down to sit appropriately within the mix. We can extend that concept to all other instruments and vocals. As another example, if there's a drum fill that we really want to be present in the mix without bringing the overall level of the drums up, we can opt to automate the fader level of the drum bus whenever the drum fill is actually played and then bring it back down after the drum fill. The third automation tip I have for you is to fix vocal plosives using fader or volume automation. Vocal plosives happen on hard consonants where part of the vocal tract or mouth closes and subsequently releases a burst of air. This burst of energy hits the microphone, causing it to overload and causes a peak in the audio signal that generally doesn't sound great and will often take away from the vocal performance. We can opt to use fader automation to bring down the overall level of the signal at each plosive to help mitigate its effects on the mix. The fourth automation tip I have for you is to control vocal throws and other special effects. A throw in mixing is an effect that is only applied to a specific part of an instrument or vocal. Taking vocals, for example, it could be an effect that is applied to only a single syllable, a single word, or even a single phrase. The vocal comes in along with the effect, and then in the next vocal, the effect is gone. To set up a vocal throw or another special throw effect, we will typically use a send and return system where we set up a return channel that is being processed by the effect, and then we will send the original track, say the vocal, for example, to that return channel. When it comes to actually bringing the throw into the mix and then taking it out of the mix, we can either automate the send level of the original track or the fader of the return channel. If you would like to learn more about parallel processing, I actually have a video on such a topic. I'll leave the card up above and a link in the description box down below. The fifth automation tip I have for you is to bump up the chorus or the climax of the song and use the mix to give this high point even more energy. We can bump up the climax by automating the volume of the mix bus up a dB or 2 during the climax. We can automate a high shelf boost a few dB to add brightness to the chorus. We can automate and widen certain elements or the mix bus as a whole to give a greater sense of dimensionality. We can increase or decrease the amount of time-based effects like reverb and delay to give more or less space to the chorus. We could automate a high-pass filter cutoff downward to give more weight to the chorus. And there are so many other things we can do with automation to really bump up the chorus or the climax of the song. I should mention, while we are on the topic of the point of highest energy of the song, that as we bring in additional tracks into the mix, it may very well be the case that there's a buildup of frequencies, especially in the low-mid range, where there's a lot of fundamental energy of different instruments. So we may want to consider having a EQ cut in certain instruments around the 400 hertz range to help kind of clean up that muddiness. My sixth automation tip is similar to the fifth, and that is automating space with reverb. As certain tracks come in and out of the mix and take precedence over others, we can use subtle EQ automation to move the less important tracks further back in the mix and even to move other tracks more forward in the mix. Additionally, like we discussed in the previous tip, we can give certain sections of the song more or less space by automating the reverb on certain buses or individual tracks. My seventh automation tip is to use automation to morph sounds. There are several ways of doing this. One of those ways is to utilize filter sweeps with an EQ plugin to alter the sound of an individual track or bus. We can also automate the balance between two or more tracks that kind of blend together to give us interesting timbral textures. We can automate distortion or saturation on individual tracks or bus to make them grittier or cleaner, depending on what the mix calls for at any specific section. We can modulate the parameters of virtually any modulation type effect, or really any plugin in general. And of course, we can modulate the parameters of our virtual instruments within our digital audio workstations to really hone in on the sounds and alter them throughout the mix with automation. The eighth automation tip is to utilize automation to make MIDI tracks and samples and loops sound more humanized. We can do so by automating volume across time, especially if we get into the finer details. We can also automate the parameters of a transient shaper or other dynamics processors that can really hone in on the dynamics and make things sound more human. We can use saturation or distortion to really muddy up more sterile sounding samples, loops, and MIDI tracks, or automate the parameters of any other plugin or process that may add a little bit of a human touch to our samples, loops, and MIDI tracks. My ninth automation tip is to automate EQ to adjust for frequency masking as certain tracks come in and out of the mix. I alluded to this in tip number 5, but as certain tracks come in and out of the mix, they may mask tracks that are already there, and by automating EQ and fixing any frequency masking here, we can have it so that when both tracks are playing together, they are nice and separate, and then as one of those tracks is removed in another section of the song, we can automate our EQ back to its original position in the track that remains. That way we can make room for all of our tracks at certain sections of the mix, helping with the overall balance of that section. And then as we move on to another section with a slightly different set of tracks, we can maintain a great balance. I also have a video on my top 11 EQ tips. I'll leave a card to that above and a link in the description box down below, and I would encourage you to check that video out after you're finished with this one. My 10th automation tip is a pretty easy one, and that is to automate the bypass of certain plugins throughout the mix. Some tracks only require certain processing to fit into certain sections of the mix, and so we can bypass any given processor when it's not needed and then bring it back in when it is needed with automation. And my 11th automation tip is especially useful for computer-based music, and that is to automate tempo slightly throughout the track. It's a natural human tendency when playing music to sort of speed up as we get to points of higher energy within our mixes. And so touching on what we discussed in tip 8, we can use slight tempo variations to sort of humanize our mixes. Tempo fluctuations can happen naturally as musicians play together, and when we are recording live off the floor without a click track, they can be inherent in a mixing session. However, we can also program tempo automation within our tracks before recording to give a more humanized feel, or if we are composing directly within our digital audio workstation, we can automate the tempo slightly to give a more human feel. So those are the 11 automation tips I have for you today. I challenge you to use at least one of these tips in whatever session you mix or compose next. And if you found this video informative, I would encourage you to hit that like button and to also check out the resources in the description box down below. Furthermore, I'll leave a few other videos in this end screen discussing my top 11 EQ tips and my top 11 compression tips. I would also encourage you to check those videos out. So click on whichever one interests you the most, and I will see you in the next video.